Good morning, Blogging Heads Nation. It's Heather Hurlburt, Executive Director of the National Security Network, and
Eli Lake, Washington Times National Security Correspondent, coming actually from the Washington Times Bureau, or rather the headquarters, the mothership of the Washington Times. So if you see people running back and forth or people screaming, stop the presses, because we're in the middle of the movie.
So I have to say, Eli, having been the child of two journalists and been brought up on the front page and other, grand old journalism movies, I'm just envisaging something wonderful, and I know my plain old backdrop is really going to lose out here. So in an effort to even the score, I'm going to roll out the grand structural conceit for the morning, which is you wanted to talk about two issues in particular, Iraq and what we're expecting at the end of the week as far as President Obama's withdrawal strategy, and the question of civil rights, civil liberties, Guantanamo, and the efforts to develop a new counterterrorism strategy and how those aren't working together. And I want to suggest, just quickly before we get diving into the specifics, that you have to look at both of those as well as things we may or may not see in the weeks ahead on Afghanistan and a fight around the defense budget, which will be coming out with other budget top lines tomorrow. In the context of the struggle that every first-term president has with the Pentagon, not so much whoever he or she has appointed there, but the sort of career bureaucracy of the Pentagon, which is very good at working the press, working the Hill, working its allies to undercut, undermine, and impose its own narrative. And all those policy areas I named are ones where the Pentagon has not even necessarily a partisan imperative, but just a kind of structural imperative to put out its own narrative, and where presidents of both parties have found their reform and change efforts run aground pretty fast. I think you can think of things both from the Clinton and Bush 2 early days.
Sure.
So I think that's an interesting backdrop. And so Iraq first.
Sure. Well, we saw the New York Times, the Washington Post, AP, our paper, all has stories that said there's going to be a 19-month combat withdrawal timeline, and that we're also going to see a contingency force of 30 to 50,000 that are going to remain in Iraq, largely as trainers and, I guess, a kind of escape valve. And I would say this sounds almost exactly what Colin Kahl, who is now joining the Pentagon as a Deputy Assistant Secretary, wrote in a paper that I disclosed to the public during the campaign, I guess almost a year ago, about sort of how Obama would approach this. And I don't think it's all that different, at least on the sort of broad points, from what McCain had in mind when he talked about a long-term presence, or even what Bush was talking about, which is that now that the major combat operations in Iraq are over, a lot of troops can go home, but will still remain in Iraq for a while, training people. And I wrote a story about a week and a half ago, which we'll link, about the out years for deliverables of tanks, airplanes, and helicopters that we've signed contracts with the Iraqi military, but they won't be delivered until 2012 and 2013. And that certainly suggests, because these are very complicated pieces of equipment, that there'll be some sort of training role in Iraq for a while to come.
Well, the one place, Eli, where I think I would draw a different emphasis is that the way I have seen the residual force explained and messaged is that it's there from 2010 to 2011, and then 2011 is when the Status of Forces Agreement envisages everybody being gone. And so the interesting thing about what happens after 2011 is that it's very much on the Iraqis' terms and not on our terms. And so if the Iraqis say, we want people in country to help us with our new tanks, but we don't want them doing training, or we want them doing this but not that, or we want them here but not there, that's then a subject of negotiation between two sovereign states, which is a pretty different model than anything that Bush and McCain were putting forward, even late in the day. I mean, really until the SOFA was signed and it became clear that that's how it was going to be. So I think that's the big conceptual difference that underlies the Obama world.
Well, Bush wanted a SOFA.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he pushed for one before he got one, and I think that the end of 2011 is a kind of artificial date. I mean, I keep hearing that these things are going to be. So first of all, SOFAs are always renegotiated. Mm-hmm. Second of all, the terms of the actual base agreements, which is usually what the meat of a SOFA is put off to later for these committees that are heavily represented by the provincial governments. Why is that important? Because while there are certainly Shia leaders who don't want American bases in southern Iraq, there are Kurdish leaders who definitely do want American bases in northern Iraq, and there are also more, as we saw in the provincial elections, the majority coalition, which includes the Anbar Awakening, also wants the al-Assad base to be American, and they want them there in some ways as a tripwire. So I think you will see the status of forces agreement renegotiated, but I mean, it is a significant change in that, the green zone is going to be no more. There's not going to be a huge kind of foreign footprint in the center of the capital where Saddam's palaces were. That's very important, and there's not going to be as many troops, and the Americans are not going to have the kind of carte blanche to do what they were doing in 2007 and 2008. And, those are significant changes, but it's not the end of the U.S.-Iraqi relationship. The Iraqi military is going to rely on the U.S. for years to come for a military that, if all cards are played correctly on both sides, will rival the Israeli military in the Middle East and be more advanced and better than any of their regional neighbors.
I think, Eli, you're veering dangerously close to grossly overpromising what the Iraqi military will do, or indeed should.
Well, they have already. I mean, I've interviewed. I mean, I've talked to the defense minister is in America right now touring American defense procurement plants. A month ago, he went to South Korea and said he looks at the South Korean-U.S. relationship as a model for U.S.-Iraqi relationship.
Well, that sounds great, but it's not the same thing as the Iraqis having a military that rivals the Israeli military. And,
okay. The Iraqis rivaling the Israelis, I may be overstating a little bit, but I'm saying
I will be scratching with my sadly diminished college fund to pay for my kids' college tuition before the Iraqi military rivals the Israeli military. So I'm not.
Okay,
I'm
fair
not
enough.
really anxious.
Okay,
but Eli, I want to go.
If that's what you're just feeding, but I'm saying that the sort of unspoken agreement, as I understand it, is, hey, would you like to buy cut-rate Chinese equipment sold to you by the Iranians, or would you like equipment that's like pretty good and almost as good as what the Israelis have, which is because we supplied the Israeli. The idea is that the Iraqis, are going to go, and the Iraqi military, first of all, they also have a really good training relationship now with the Americans after, fighting alongside of them in their war against Al-Qaeda and the remnants of, sort of the bad Sadr, rejectionists and the rejectionists that didn't reconcile on the Ba'ath side. So in that, they've sort of fought in a war, and the majors who are going to be becoming lieutenant colonels in our military have relationships and deep relationships with the lieutenant colonels becoming colonels in the Iraqi military. And, I think that's another, I think it's going to be a deeper relationship. And one of the questions I would ask to you, Heather, is would you rather have the relationship we now are having with the Iraqi military, or would you rather have what we have with the Pakistani or the Egyptian military, which is a leader-to-leader, general-to-general relationship, but we have little clue as to what's going on in the mid-ranks?
I would suggest to you, Eli, that the answer is to find ways to have better relationships at the mid-level without invading the country first. I don't.
Well, you couldn't have a mid-level to mid-level relationship with Saddam's military. I mean, that's...
No, but you would never have invaded... I mean, if the reason we invaded Iraq is to build a new relationship with a new Iraqi military, I'll sort of add that to my list of rationales that I don't...
It's not...
Very much
you're looking at it,
for.
You're getting defensive about rationales. I mean, most Democrats
No, I'm just
supported the
trying to
Iraq War in
find
2003.
rationales. And as you know, I'm on record as having opposed it in 2003, so I actually,
right.
unlike many people, I have nothing to be defensive about. I guess what I'm trying to tease out of what you're saying, Eli, is where, what it is you think that I'm secretly disagreeing with you about. Because my view is, Obama's promise in the campaign was that we would get combat troops out of there. He's now, promise kept. We're going to hear on Friday exactly how that's going to happen over what period of time. The folks on the other side were never particularly interested in promising to get combat troops out of there. So that's a dramatic difference. There was an understanding that the kind of relationship you wanted to have with Iraq going forward, including, by the way, the possibility of having the kind of strong relationship with mid-level officers that you discussed, is predicated on the mid-level officers not feeling like you're occupying their country. And, by the way, one of the problems in Pakistan, just to kind of lurch over there for a minute, is that you haven't had actually a specific effort to engage mid-level officers, or you've had a tiny one. And actually my understanding is there is a tiny one and that it's very productive. And the frustrating thing, it was shut down for a while with the sanctions after the nuclear tests. And again, on the one hand, it's understandable why that happened, but it's had rather dramatically bad consequences in terms of our not really knowing what the Pakistanis are doing, the Pakistanis not having a feeling of trust for us, and indeed having a pretty strong feeling of distrust for us. So, again, there's a lot we can do better in terms of understanding how you integrate mill-mill relationships into your overall strategic framework, but invading a country is not usually step one.
Listen, the Obama campaign gave the impression in the primary, as did the Hillary campaign in the primary, that they were going to get all the troops out of Iraq. That was the Democratic position. The Democratic position was...
Eli, nobody ever said anything other than get all the combat troops out of Iraq. If you took away that impression, it's because you wanted to.
No, it's not because I wanted to. It's because they were playing to the anti-war base. They opposed the surge, which the surge was effective. It ended the prospect of a civil war largely, and we can now manage a withdrawal. I think if anything, Obama and you have come around to the Republican and the McCain position, which was we shouldn't leave until we can leave in a situation where not only Iraq is better, but our relationship with Iraq as well. Whereas the Democratic position in 2006 was basically leave because there was no possible way it could get any better. It has gotten a lot better. We're going to have this relationship with an Iraqi military, which was unthinkable 2 years ago, largely because, President Bush ignored the Council of Democrats in Congress, and Obama was in Congress at the time. He took this position, and now he's going to get a lot of combat troops out. But there was never a position that
Eli, I think
Republicans never defended the idea that we wanted 100,000 combat troops ad infinitum into Iraq. That was a MoveOn.org campaign slogan, but that wasn't.
But Eli, Republicans were totally uninterested in sketching out how the withdrawal would happen or when it would happen, or making it real either to Iraqis or to Americans how and when it would happen. So we have no reason to believe.
Well, there's good reason for that in 2007 and 2008 when you're in the middle of a war in which Al Qaeda is every day claiming that they're going to drive the Americans out. Yes, once you've crushed Al Qaeda in Iraq, you can start talking about when you're going to leave because you don't have the same strategic implications.
So, Eli, you have ventured firmly into the land of counterfactuals because the person who's now president has been saying since 2007 that this is what should happen. Iraqis have been hearing Americans say since 2007, in fact, since 2006, as you pointed out, that this is what should happen. And indeed, I think if you give Democrats in Congress credit, as you just did, for forcing the change in strategy that led to
I'm not giving the Democrats credit for anything on Iraq, Heather. I think
Eli,
Democrats have only complicated our efforts in Iraq.
About a minute and hear that you just did, but
I didn't give them credit. What I said was the Democrats their position was get troops out of Iraq. What Iraqis heard when I was on the ground in Iraq was that there was a huge fight over trying to get the population to trust the military in a multi-confessional war. And the idea was that if you have a bunch of people in Washington saying, we're going to leave Iraq, the next Democratic president is going to leave Iraq in the middle of a war like that.
But Eli, you did
then it was
have
hard.
that.
It made the job of the military harder. It didn't make it easier.
That's exactly what you did have, and in fact, it made the job of the military easier because it.
No, it didn't it made the job much harder for the military.
How?
Because
show me one concrete instance.
Why?
No,
okay.
show me. No, Eli. One concrete instance where you can documentable Iraqis saying, if you Americans weren't saying you were going to leave in 3 years, this would be much easier. I think you can document a lot of instances
now you're twisting my word. No, wait a
contrary.
second, Heather. I think it's time for Democrats to own the fact that their position was to leave in the middle of a civil war, no matter what the consequences were, and that when they were saying that in 2007, when things were less sure, I was in Baghdad and meeting with these communities saying, you can't leave right now. If you leave, we're going to be killed by these Al Qaeda people. You got to tell us that these stories that we're hearing on Al Jazeera are wrong.
Obama or Clinton ever said we should leave in the middle of a civil war regardless of the consequences. You're taking opinions that everybody in the U.S. and in Iraq understood were not the opinions of people who were going to be running the government anytime soon and trying to,
Okay.
It would be like me gratuitously throwing 100 years in Iraq back at you, which I have not done yet, but I have clearly been too restrained in not doing so.
No, I think the Democrats were clearly in 2007, making the job much harder because the job
but I
was
don't
to
care
convince
what you think.
populations
I want to know what
trust
Iraqis
Americans.
think, and you can't
That's
document
what,
for
I've
me.
interviewed Iraqis who said that. If you talk to Sheikh Ahmed, he would say, and he still does say, he wants the Americans there, and and that in 2007, it's very different to say that in 2009. On that, we can clearly agree. But in 2007, when you say we want to plan for withdrawal as soon as possible, and you have a military whose job as protecting the population is to get them to say, count on us, we're the strong horse, we're going to stick around, Al-Qaeda's going to lose. It was uncertain in 2007 when it is. So when you had Democrats saying, we should get out, we should get out, we should get out, which is how it was filtered back to Iraqis, I think it complicated the efforts, and I think that's a fairly straightforward point. It's not just...
So, Eli, I think it may be a straightforward point, but it may also be a wrong point. And here are my read. First of all, by 2007, actual, not just sort of one person here and there, but, scientific sort of public opinion studies were clearly, Iraqis were saying, yeah, it's time for the Americans to start moving toward the exit. The negotiations for the SOFA
I dispute that.
You can look it up.
You're speaking for the Iraqi public opinion.
You can look it up online. Second...
I know I can look. I know there's plenty of
Eli,
polls that can say whatever you want in Iraq.
By 2008, you can look at the negotiations for the SOFA, and it's clear that the pressure that the Iraqi government found itself coming under from its own political establishment was get a harder, earlier deadline for the Americans to get their combat troops out, which is also a pretty reliable indicator of what at least elite opinion was. Third, you did have, from 2006 on, Iraqis clearly understanding that there was a significant political force in America that was going to pull troops out. And you have the results that you now have, which are that Iraqis have stepped up, are participating more in political life. The recent provincial elections were a real significant step forward, that violence is down. And those were all undertaken with the understanding that the U.S. was not going to be there for 100 years or even 10 years, as various Republicans like to say. So I think we had exactly the environment you're describing, and it worked to our advantage. And it's time for Republicans to own that.
Well, I think the main thing I really want to dispute here is that Democrats, by talking about wanting to leave Iraq, which was a position which I find to be morally reprehensible and strategically foolish, were in some ways helping the effort to try to regain a security and defeat the enemy. Now, the reason why we have participation and successful provincial elections in Iraq is because the people who were deliberately trying to foment a civil war were defeated. Those efforts required, to a certain extent, for military units on a very ground level to gain the trust of the population. It is hard for the military to gain the trust of that population when Arab media is amplifying over and over again statements from people like Harry Reid and others saying that we'd lost the war and that we're going to retreat no matter what the consequences are. Because they have to make a calculation. Do we stay? Who do we think is going to stick around longer? Do we want to make a deal with Al-Qaeda, which will be very miserable, or can we trust to make a deal with the Americans that they'll stick around?
Eli,
and so I'm saying that in 2007, when you have Democratic leaders insisting that we leave to play to their political base, it made the job harder. It didn't make it insurmountable,
Eli,
obviously, but you did not contribute to that scenario.
You can't actually document for me an instance in which this made it harder. And I think, what you can document is that
I just told you how it made it harder.
For every one time Al Jazeera showed Harry Reid, there were 10 times that Al Jazeera showed evidence of, whether real or somewhat hyped, American soldiers mistreating Iraqi civilians. And that was certainly, and again, this is just because of the situation we're in, it's nobody's particular fault, but that pressure and the feeling that was going to go on indefinitely was making it much harder on a much more concrete basis to gain the trust of Iraqi civilians than something that some guy named Harry Reid, who, most Iraqis have no idea who he was.
I'm saying, if you're making a calculation,
Eli,
who's going to stick
there's
around
one
longer?
other thing, which you've got the history of this exactly backwards. That the thing that happened in Iraq that started turning Iraq around, first of all, the Anbar Awakening. And the Anbar Awakening is first and foremost a courageous group of tribal leaders who said, you know what, we are tired of Al-Qaeda and we are tired of what they're doing to our communities, and we're going to go and ask the Americans to help us out with this. But they took the first step themselves. And there you have both sort of fortuitousness in the presence at that moment in time of an American military leader who understood the potential significance of this and was able to take advantage of it, and the political pressure that had been built up by Democrats, including the anti-war Democrats who kept saying, no, we want him out now, out now, out now, which that pressure enabled you to build up a response which was, we're going to change our strategy. At the same time as it was being made clear, that there could be a buildup, but it wouldn't last forever. And so that's how politics works.
Okay, so you're saying that if you're making a narrow point that the Democrats saying that we need to get out forced Bush to change the strategy, then yes, I mean that's obvious. The election in 2006 forced Bush to fire Rumsfeld, which Democrats should have taken credit for, and then they should have recognized that there was a new strategy. But what did Democrats do? They went with the Baker-Hamilton recommendations, which were
James Baker, by the way, not a Democrat. The last time I checked.
Well, I mean, for the purposes of this debate in 2006 and 2007, he is a Democrat.
He'd be stunned and dismayed to hear that.
Well, all right, fine, but I'm just saying. I mean, he's not a Democrat, I guess. Anyway. But in that respect, instead of I wrote a column at the time. I said, why can't Democrats take credit for forcing the president to change their strategy and at least give this strategy, which employs principles of counterinsurgency, protects the population, and is really much more than just a troop surge. But instead, it was seen as this horrible political affront, and and there was an effort for a year and a half to not hear anything to not accept what was clearly the sort of effective strategy was working, and to sort of blot it out. We still hear it. I mean, I can say. Go back and read some of the progressive bloggers like Matthew Iglesias. He, to this day, doesn't think that, it had anything to do with it, which I think, I'm not saying you were like that, Heather. You've been pretty reasonable. But my point here is that I have very firsthand experience that when there was all these efforts to try to, and they kept saying we're going to end the war and everything like that, it did have an effect. It wasn't insurmountable, but it did have an effect. But if you want to make the point that the 2006 election in particular forced the president to change his strategy, I fully grant that. He did have to change his strategy. He did it in response to a political event, which was an election. He disregarded the advice of Baker-Hamilton, which the Democrats accepted, and then ended up picking a much better strategy that Keegan and Kaine and Petraeus ultimately came up with.
So the interesting thing, of course, is that they ended up at least marginally implementing most, or starting toward implementing most of the Baker-Hamilton recommendations. So I'm curious. The
Baker-Hamilton was not the surge. Baker-Hamilton was cut a deal with all of the outside actors and work out some contact group,
most of which actually
give up on the prospect of any elections, which we just had, so thank God we didn't do that. I mean, there's all kinds of things that the Baker-Hamilton group recommended that were ignored largely, and if you remember, the argument that the Democrats kept making at the time was, we don't like the surge, we want Baker-Hamilton. Well, thank God we didn't have Baker-Hamilton. Thank God we had the surge. Now we're in this great position where Obama can can bring out all these combat troops from Iraq, and we can still maybe have a couple bases in the north and the west of Iraq, and sell them Abrams tanks and helicopters, and have this long-term relationship with Iraq.
So Eli, what I don't understand here is that the left helped you get exactly what you wanted, and you're full of, or what you now say you wanted, and you're full of outrage about it. I mean, I think you should.
I'm not full of outrage about it. I think it's time to set the record straight.
You should be sending Iglesias love notes and saying, thank you. Sorry.
I'm not going to send Iglesias any love notes. I think Iglesias is, allergic to empirical reality. But
Eli, look, you're kind of allergic to political reality, if I may say so, because again, this is how policy change happens. You have folks on the outside and folks on the inside. You have folks who take absolute positions and whose strength is that they take those absolute positions, and then you have folks who say, okay, given that you've got people over here on the left, or it could be on the right, because Republican politics works the same way, taking absolute positions which are going to cause you and the government X amount of trouble, how are you going to negotiate between those things? And here's some reality on the ground that we think you should work with. So that is how politics works. And
well, if you want to say, I can see that the 2006 election, when Democrats took back the Congress of the House and the Senate, that it forced, ultimately Rumsfeld gets fired, there's a strategic recalculation, and Bush has to choose what to do on Iraq. Except the choice that he chooses is exactly what the Democrats say is so terrible. I'm just saying that it turns out that, are you denying any of this? This is what happened.
No,
he chose a strategy that was seen as like extending the war. It's hopeless. There's nothing that's good going to happen. There were all these moralistic arguments. It was absurd. I think the net left owes Hagan and Petraeus an apology.
The Bush people put the surge in place, and the evident continuing and growing strength of Democrats made it clear to everybody that the surge was not going to go on indefinitely, whatever the administration's desires might be, and different people in the administration gave very different signals including 100 years and some other choice ones about how long and in what strength we intended to be there. But yet it was always clear that with Democratic strength growing in Congress, growing in public, and with, a presidential campaign that, more often than not looked like it was going to come out with a Democrat, whether it was Obama or Clinton on top, you always had the clear secondary message being sent that it's very unlikely that this surge is going to stick around forever. And you also then had both congressional pressures mounting in 2008, the election and the need to help, the perceived need to help McCain, and by making it look as if things were going better and some troops could start coming home. And third, just the awful reality that the military needed the relief. So that you again had these pressures pushing the administration back toward the Democrats, and the Democrats enabled that to happen by not moving off their positions. And again, that's how politics works.
So explain to me this: so because Democrats were wrong about the surge, and they kept being wrong about the surge, it signaled to the Iraqis that they had to get their act together? Is that what you're saying?
Because Democrats were clear from the beginning that they didn't think the surge was a long-term solution. That signaled to the Iraqis they had to get their act together, and that was one of the components that made the surge successful. And then, again, if you talk about the surge in isolation, that's not very interesting. If you combine...
Right, you took the counterinsurgency strategy. I agree with that. It's
the
not just the
counterinsurgency strategy, the surge, and a political strategy that made it clear that there was an end date in sight where the Iraqis were really going to have to pick things up for themselves. Yeah. And that's the piece that I think the Democrats deserve credit for.
No, I don't see any evidence for that. I think that basically during the period where there was a contest over chaos and order, and the U.S. was basically asking the Iraqi population to trust them, to work with them, to root out members of al-Qaeda, members of al-Assad's organization that were kidnapping people, and so forth and so on. When they were trying to get the violence, they needed cooperation from the population to do it. The population, at that point, needs to make a choice, and I just don't see how you get around this. Either you bet on do you think that one military is going to stick around and outlast and win against another? And the Iranians are saying, hey, we're going to be here forever, so you better make your deal with us. And the Americans are saying, no, you better make your deal with us. And I think it was harder to do so when you had such a vocal opposition. Now, that said, I want to say this one now. We live in democracy, and there were a lot of people who were just sick of the war, and our democracy works the way it works. So, I don't even want to necessarily wag a finger at the Democrats, because they have to represent a constituency that wanted to end the war. They were elected by people who wanted to end the war, and if they were disloyal to their constituency, then they were not doing their function in this country. So, in that respect, I understand it. I can't, at the end of the day, I'm not going to summon, I'm trying not to, use a lot of righteous anger on this stuff anyway. I understand it. I just don't think it was helpful in the strategy. It does. You can do both.
Well, Eli, there's two things. One is I think your construct of what was going on in Iraq is a little bit off, and that leads you to the conclusion you draw. Because if you frame it as sort of the U.S. versus Iran, then of course
it's not just Iran. It was a U.S. versus Iran. Al-Qaeda.
Eli, if you frame it as the decision people were having to make was, could you envision the Iraqis who were going around on patrols with the Americans in 2007, 2008? Could you envision them growing to a point where you could trust them? And that was the strategy, and that was the thing that was ultimately successful, and that the political debate in the U.S. helped, because it was clear that the Iraqi military and police forces weren't just the sort of the window dressing or the bad window dressing that they had appeared to be at some earlier periods, that they were going to have to be, because it was clear, if you followed the political debate in the U.S., that the U.S. wasn't around for the long term. And then this comes to the constituency point that you raised, and that that political theorists wring their arms about, of the, quote, difficulty of democracies waging long drawn-out wars. And the interesting thing is, if you look at public opinion, the feeling of fatigue with the war extended across party lines. The solutions for that were a little different across party lines, but the feeling of fatigue and concern extends across party lines. And that, sort of brings me to what I find most astonishing about this whole conversation, which is that, Obama's going to announce this plan. And it's not really news, and we're not expecting a lot of disagreement, and you and I don't have a big argument about it. And that to me is the sort of the big headline here, that we're at the point that we're foreseeing an end to this war that's going to make the left wing of the Democratic Party feel like it won, and that's also going to make the U.S. military feel like it won. And that's a real achievement that I actually think Democrats deserve a lot of credit for over the last 2 years, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally by folks whose preferred outcomes were a little different from this. But there was a consistent effort to drive toward this day, and here we are, and that's kind of an amazing thing.
All right. First of all, the left wing of the Democratic Party at some point needs to needs to know that it's losing. And it's important for the Democratic Party. And now that they're in power, there's going to be, and this is a good segue maybe to civil liberties, that now that the Democrats are in power, there's going to be a number of decisions that are going to be made that are going to reflect the inevitable compromises of a party that, is at the height of, control of the government and Congress at this point. And I don't think that the left wing of the Democratic Party offers any. I mean, I think that, if we were to follow, the precepts of the left wing of the Democratic Party, we would be not only less secure, but I think the world would be less free. And I guess my issue is that I think that there has been a tremendous amount. I guess I can say that I think at the end of the day, I think in 2005 and 2006, I would agree Iraq was worse than it was under Saddam, which was such a low bar. And that was a real source of shame. And there was a really legitimate question to ask. I can't believe that, we could not make Iraq better than it was under the horrors of Saddam Hussein. But now I think it's clearly not only better than it was in 2005 and 2006, it's better than it was under Saddam Hussein. And I think it looks like Iraq is on a trajectory to continue to get better. And as time goes on and Iraq hopefully continues to improve, in large part because of the sacrifice of American blood and treasure, then I think that we will see the war in a very different light. And I think that, in that respect, I felt very strongly from the beginning that we could not just leave Iraq into the conditions that we were, and that was clearly where I think that there was at least the implications of what Democrats were saying. I don't have all these quotes in front of me. But I think that in that respect, I think it's important that, I think the left wing of the Democratic Party will be made to feel like it's losing because Obama is the president of the United States, which is a world power. And it's going to have to do things that world powers do.
So, Eli, what I think is funny here is that I think your the paradigm you're trying to create for the left wing of the Democratic Party is actually much more restrictive and narrow and unhappy than the paradigm that they're creating for themselves. And I'm going to use a wonderful trope from marriage counseling, which is that the place you want to get to in a marriage is where you're not sort of counting up, well, I compromised 5 things today and he compromised 5 things yesterday, but okay, so we got to a place that we can both feel good about and feel like we both helped create it. And so where we are right now within the whole broad scope of not just the Democratic Party, but a bunch of other groups and folks as well who feel like they're part of the Obama administration, is that, nobody's entirely happy. The civil liberties community would have liked to see some things they haven't seen. People are anxious about Afghanistan, and legitimately so, and feel like, there's no clear strategy there, and you don't want to just start dumping troops in there for purposes that either you don't understand or maybe aren't achievable. People have concerns from the left about various aspects of the bailouts, and those are, again, some of them I think are really reasonable. But people
they don't like the $1 trillion being infused in the economy.
No, they don't like CEO pay. They don't like bailing out banks more than you're bailing out homeowners. We could go on and on about that. But the overall point here is people see other important ways in which the left, number one, played an important role in Obama getting elected, and number two, that things that have been their rallying cries for years are now, coming out of the president's mouth at the State of the Union. We do not torture. So I think it's interesting that you're almost being more purist, where I think you've got a wonderful moment, and it isn't going to last forever, and it isn't going to be perfect, and there's going to be unhappiness and fighting, and that's all normal and even good for the reasons of politics I was laying out before. But actually, you have this marvelous moment where the left is one of a number of constituencies working together to come up with mutually acceptable outcomes, which are a hell of a lot better than where we were over the last 8 years. And I think, the Guantanamo piece. The point I want to make about Guantanamo is those executive orders were just a beginning. They weren't in any way a final solution. Sorry, that was a terrible phrase to use. They weren't in any way the final answer to any of this. So the question is now, are we doing the hard work to get other countries to help us not just take some of these folks, but really monitor them, given some of the problems we know we had with the Bush administration failing to warn countries who received prisoners, and then, frankly, some of the rehabilitation programs not working all that well.
Right.
How long?
You know where the rehabilitation programs work really well? In Anbar province, where there will be a military base for 50 years.
You know, the other points that I would make about this are, since it turns out these individuals' files are scattered all across government, how long is that going to take to put this stuff together?
Sure.
And just the public relations aspect of this is really enormous and terrifying, because people have been told one set of things about these people for the past 6 years, and it's just human to find it a little whiplashy to suddenly go to being told something completely different. So that's a huge challenge that you're asking an administration to run while it's running two wars, a depression, or whatever we're supposed to call the economic situation this week. My messaging on that is way, way behind. But that this is going to be, and that everybody understands that this, and conservatives understand this too, which is why they're going out and attacking it all the time, that this is a work in progress. There's going to be a debate and a campaign even around the set of answers on how do we mesh our respect for civil liberties and our successful fight against terrorism. For a long time, January 21st didn't answer all those questions, but the fact that, again, you're having a dialogue in which the civil libertarians can have a loud voice and can see that their voice is being heard and responded to, that's just so different that I think nobody feels, and nobody's going to feel like, oh, we've lost and this is so terrible and we're shut out. That's not.
Well, I don't think I wrote that in the New Republic piece, which we'll link to. Listen, it's significant that effectively Obama ended the category of prisoners called enemy combatants. So effectively everybody is now going to be treated as a prisoner of war. All 243 people in Guantanamo will be treated as prisoners of war under the three Geneva Conventions, and that is very significant, and it is a change. So I guess I would say that there were, and then the other point that I would make, which I think is important, is that really you don't want to start this after 9/11. You really need to start this in 1995, and that's when the Clinton White House ordered the CIA to begin its program to get these Al-Qaeda people off the street, and then often, send them sometimes to U.S. courtrooms and U.S. jails, but other times to Egyptian jails where there's pretty strong evidence that they were tortured.
Eli, you do know that there were renditions before 1995, right?
There were, but there weren't. There was a specific program for the CIA that was directed against Al-Qaeda. So I would say the kind of war against Al-Qaeda, maybe you could start it at 1995. The U.S. war against Al-Qaeda starts in 95 with this order to the CIA to begin getting these guys off the street. And there were renditions before, like Carlos de Jackal and so forth and so on, but it wasn't, Carlos de Jackal was rendition to France. We got, I don't know, we've used to rendition people at times back to, this is when we really started, more kind of using the jurisdictions or courts in the Middle East in countries that do torture people. And I would note that for now, at least, and this may change after a review of rendition policy, Obama did not say we will never send people to countries that torture people. It said that we will, my understanding of it after reporting it out, and Leon Panetta sort of said this in testimony, is that they will get better assurances than they did under Clinton, that if someone was renditioned to a place that tortures people, that they will not be tortured when they were renditioned. And as I think I said, that's changed, but it's not exactly the same change as before. And it's not a broad sweeping change. And again, you're right. It may be that Greg Craig will decide with.
I don't know. Making sure people aren't tortured seems like a pretty broad sweeping change.
Well,
I continue to be fascinated that you have, a definition of change that's really kind of sectarian in its specific. And I have to say, I don't hear many people on the left who are as ferocious in their extremism about change as this. It's just the other thing that I just find fascinating is to be in a dialogue with you where I want to talk about political developments that are going on right now, and you really want to talk about the past, and I'm just finding that fascinating.
Well, fair enough, but I think in order to understand the current developments of what Obama did, we need to understand the past. And the point that I would make on this is that if you read the positions that the ACLU had, they wanted Obama to adopt, Obama did not quite do all of that, and it seems to me that he's leaving at least the option open that you can rendition someone to Egypt. And, under Clinton, and under Bush, I might add, there were documents that were provided to the CIA that said these people are going to be treated under humane standards, and they weren't worth anything. And so if you have a better system, which I don't know exactly how that works, then good on everyone. But
well, look,
it
one
seems
thing
that
is a better system is that you follow up, and after you have reports,
Sure.
and you don't then. I mean, I think that the
Okay.
difference between the Clinton policy and the Bush policy is not that the Clinton policy was so perfect or that no one ever got tortured, but that it was used in a very small number of cases and had to be authorized by very, very high-level people who knew the risk they were, or who knew the problem they were incurring. And whereas with the Bush administration, you seem to have had, okay, there was a problem, so let's send twice as many people. And that's, again, that to me is a significant major change. And as you said,
Right.
we can perhaps do better than we did under the Clinton years, but
after 9/11, Heather, the Clinton approach was seen as inadequate. I think everybody agreed with that.
No, I actually don't know that everybody. I mean, that not enough people were getting tortured? I mean,
No,
after
9/11, they said, well, it's not, okay, contrary to what some on the right say, it's not like Clinton didn't do anything against al-Qaeda. There was an enormous effort in the shadows to try to get al-Qaeda leaders. They took shots at them. I mean, there were a lot of things that were done. And after 9/11, it was seen, okay, so what is on the books right now about how we go after al-Qaeda? Okay, well, let's try to do more of it. That's obviously a summary of what went on, but that is kind of what happened.
To go back to the specific point you made, if there had been any effort after 9/11 to actually check in with people who were the leading experts in interrogation, they would have been told that actually more physical pressure, more torture doesn't get you better results. And that is the general consensus of people who are professional interrogators.
Yeah,
but
that's the general consensus of people who have left government and said that. And I'm not arguing that it does get you what you want, but there are a lot of people who clearly think that there are times when people would be tortured. After all, why would you send people to situations under Clinton where they would be tortured if you think it never worked? And for that matter, why has every war ever fought pretty much include some element of it? I don't like it. I'd like to end it, but I'm just saying I don't buy that we've had this argument before, I don't buy that it's not, in a very narrow sense, effective or always ineffective. I think you do get false positives.
Eli, I'm going to go someplace metaphysical, and that seems appropriate because it's Ash Wednesday to wind up the discussion. But the reason that there's torture in every war and in every conflict situation like this is that we're deeply broken, flawed human beings who have a profound need for revenge and a desire in situations where we've been hurt or people we love have been hurt to inflict pain on others, and it's terribly easy for us, regardless of our political affiliation, to confuse that with strategic imperatives and policymaking.
I would agree with you, and I also would like to end torture, but as we said in an earlier thing, if we really want to get serious about it, then we have to look at our history of working, training, and funding intelligence and security services in the Third World that rely upon torture also as a means of propping up authoritarian states.
So next time, can we talk about accountability?
Well, we can. Okay, yeah, we're almost done. But do you have any strong thoughts on Leahy's Truth and Reconciliation and so forth?
I'm torn on it, I have to say, because on the one hand, I like the way he and Conyers have developed it, and I think I have, I was a kid, sort of weaned on the Watergate hearings. And I do like the idea of making it more clear exactly what happened, making it easier for a broader swath of people to understand how it is that our checks and balances failed and the rule of law wasn't observed and how it became possible, as we said, for people to do more things on a broad scale without anybody asking whether it was okay. And so I would like to see that happen as a, sunshine is the best disinfectant kind of thing. I have two concerns about it. One is I don't want to see that get in the way of the things that need to happen to move forward, and I'm just not sure how much the system can stand at once, given all the other stuff that's going on. And I do think, and I know this will get me in trouble with many of my progressive allies, but I think it's easy to miss the sweet spot where we say, oh, there are lots of people who should go to prison, versus the sort of I was just following orders defense. And I think the trick, the sweet spot that I would like to hit is a place where people who were told by their superiors that they had good legal opinions saying that what they were doing was okay. On the one hand, I don't want to see those people in prison. On the other hand, I want to reinforce a message throughout government that people should use their own minds and critical faculties and ethical judgment about what's right and wrong, and that just the fact that somebody above you has a legal opinion doesn't make it doesn't mean, I mean, again, back to this terrible question of human fallibility that we were discussing a little while ago, doesn't make it okay to shut off your own critical faculties. So I guess I'm in favor of accountability if it's done right, which is sort of an easy and cheap thing to say.
Well, I mean, my view is a little muddled as well, in the sense that I, as a journalist, would like to see as much information as possible that doesn't endanger, operations against terror networks to be disclosed. I've always been concerned about overclassification, and, I've been very consistent about it, even when the right was calling for the prosecution of the New York Times. So in that respect, I like the idea of this. I don't think it's going to happen politically, just because I'm pretty sure that it's somewhere in the dungeons of the CIA briefing files, there's people like Jane Harman and Nancy Pelosi are probably not only agreeing at some point in some of these questionable programs, but at least I've heard that, this is all, we haven't seen the stuff yet. So we need to put this with a grain of salt. But I'm getting from government sources who say that, in fact, Democrats after 9/11 wanted more. And that this was very much a sort of agreed on in that, committee of, 12 that includes the chairman and the vice chairman of the intelligence committees, as well as the leadership of the House and the Senate.
Actually, Eli, the strongest argument for having an accountability commission is that you can push that kind of crap out there, and there's no, and you can say that's true, and I can say no, it's not.
Right.
And
that's why I started off saying I'd like to see this done. Now, my concern obviously is that I'd like to see the commission run by people who are not Jacobins. So, I think you'd have to have
Pat Leahy, no Jacobin.
Oh, yes, he does. And certainly John Conyers is a Jacobin. I mean, John Conyers is anyway, I don't get off from John Conyers, but not my favorite lawmaker. So I think I think it would be important to sort of do this, but I just would point out, though, that one of the first decisions of the Holder Justice Department was to maintain the secrecy privilege that Bush invoked in the case against Jepson Data Plan, the subsidiary of Boeing that is alleged to be used in a lot of the extraordinary rendition flights. So why would, we don't know what's in this brief that they want to keep from the public, but it seems to me that might suggest that some of the things that were very controversial under Bush, are practices that we might see under the Obama administration in part continued. And we certainly know, but we didn't even talk about this, but FISA and surveillance issues, there was a compromise finally on FISA that Obama did support, has not even been brought up as a policy that would change.
Well, the reason FISA hasn't come up yet, actually, is that the next round of legislative expirations, both of FISA and of various provisions of the Patriot Act, are in December, and there's a very deliberate strategy on the part of the Hill and the advocacy groups that that's a second half of the year issue. So that'll come up.
Okay.
But, again.
All right, we'll see.
So,
okay, then that's
so no,
interesting.
there'll be a fun. You and I will be debating about that in the second half of the year, I think. So that's a promise of something to come back.
I'm saying that there's this state secret, and then and the other thing I would just point out is that we've seen, at least from Dennis Blair, from Leon Panetta, and from even Joe Biden, is that leaving open the possibility that there would be certain people who could not be tried in open court and sent back to another country or freed, that would just sort of be detained, or maybe there would be sort of another military commissions process. That, I think, is in a different category, by the way, than some of the extraordinary renditions and torture issues. I mean, I don't know where you come on that, but I mean, they're all related, but that is, I think, a little bit of a different issue. So
yeah, I mean, I think on all of these things, the key point is that the administration just knows how much it doesn't know, and so it wouldn't surprise. I mean, they don't know. And I mean, there's clearly a debate going on about the military commission's point, but it's really hard to resolve that debate on a factual basis until you see what's in the files, and if you can't find the files, that's pretty challenging. On the secrecy provisions, I think there's a problem. I mean, God knows if I were at the Justice Department, I would feel very, very limited confidence that I had any in-depth understanding of what was in some of those filings and what impact it would have, not necessarily on the ability to use particular techniques, but on so-called sources and methods, who's named, what countries are named, what kind of diplomatic embarrassment would it cause. There's just all kinds of reasons. And two other points. One is, again, I mean, sorry to keep harping on my sort of frailty of humanity point, but when have you ever had an administration that voluntarily gave away?
No, it's fine.
So
I made that point in my New Republic piece. I agree. That's a very big deal.
Yeah, but there was a point that you sort of made the point, but you didn't draw the connection, which is it's time for the legislative branch to reassert itself and say we're actually going to pass some laws defining what's a state secret and what's not, and what the privilege extends to and what it doesn't. And that...
I can't say who I talked to, but I talked to some people in the Obama administration who are not keen on that.
Of course they're not. That's the tension that the Founding Fathers built into our system. Isn't it glorious?
Right. I'm saying, though, it's interesting that the Obama administration is like, I don't want to see any of that. Like, that's a non-starter.
Of course. I mean,
right.
That's
right. No, and
that's
it's funny.
the glory of Madison.
Right, and it's nice it's nice in some ways. I mean, and it's not good for the economy or the world, but I mean, it is nice in some ways that the Republicans are finally out of power. So, I mean, like, I think Republicans and conservatives can rediscover their fondness for limited government, their fondness for accountability, and so forth, which was clearly corrupted when a lot of Republicans and conservatives felt that they had to defend Bush in areas where I didn't always defend Bush, but I mean, I think that people felt an obligation to defend Bush against, kind of political criticisms where. I don't think they should have. I mean, I thought that Bush was absolutely ridiculous on FISA, and also he tried at one point to prosecute, individual private citizens for leaking, classified information. And there was an effort in the Justice Department to sort of, get into this issue that would have made my job very perilous. And there were a lot of things that Bush did that were executive power grabs that I think conservatives should be really uncomfortable with. And it's, in some ways, being out of power is an opportunity for conservatives to sort of rediscover that.
If I may say so, you got to find a better spokesman for it than Bobby Jindal.
You didn't like Jindal's speech?
I thought... I thought it really undersold what a smart guy Jindal is and what interesting things he's done, and I'm not just saying that because we went to...
Refrain America can do anything? Everything? We can do whatever we want.
Yeah, well, I thought actually he was not well served, and the sort of fallback on the claim that Obama's trying to cut the defense budget.
We should. I'm sorry we didn't get it.
Yeah, and whoever was advising him on that, he was really sort of going back to some talking points from 10 or 15 years ago that I think are not well judged for the time we're in. So whatever the new conservative standard is, what Jindal's done in Louisiana may or may not be a good representation of that. But the speech we got last night was not a particular. I mean, we were just not a particularly good representation of that.
Yeah, and just really quickly on the defense appropriations issue. There's an element here, which is that, coin doctrine, the counterinsurgency doctrine, would dictate that you don't want to spend a lot of money on heavy kind of Cold War era equipment, and that the thing you want to invest in is Predator drones and better training and better special forces. And these things may end up being the same price tag as other stuff, but traditionally the kind of the services wish list is not going to cohere with the sort of new warfighting doctrine that Petraeus employed in Iraq and is I think now going to try to employ with McCain in Afghanistan.
Yeah. And what happened, as I was saying to you before the call on this cycle, is that the Pentagon was not asked by the outgoing Bush administration to do a budget. It went ahead and did a budget submission anyway, which was kind of the services wish list. Right. Then it was sent to the Office of Management and Budget, the new Obama folks, who sent it back and said, thank you very much, you're going to cut this back down. At which point people ran leaking to Fox News saying, oh, Obama is cutting the defense budget. And in fact, what you're going to see when the budget numbers come out tomorrow is a small increase that reflects efforts to bring as much as possible of the supplementals that have just grown completely out of control in the last 8 years back onto the regular budget. So you're going to see a budget number, a top-line defense number that looks like an increase, but in fact is going to reflect sort of improved budget discipline and trying to make sure that everything you're spending is in the budget, as opposed to just sort of going to Congress and asking for more whenever you feel like it.
Right.
So there are all kinds of debates to be had around the defense budget, and I actually agree with you that I want. I want Republicans debating from smart positions, but where Jindal went last night was kind of an old talking point.
Well, Heather, I just ended on this, that we hear a whole lot about missile defense, but I'd like to see more money put into missile offense.
What, am I supposed to turn red and have my head explode on the screen?
Where's the money for missile offense?
That's great. I'm going to get you
that
a
actually
t-shirt.
was Kennedy's thing. He was at the missile gap was his big issue.
Okay, viewers, will somebody send Eli a t-shirt that says "I'm for missile offense," please?
I'm for missile offense.
And he will wear it the next time we meet to debate. So
all right,
have a good
great
day.
talking to you, Heather.
Bye-bye.
Okay.